Dear Martin, here is to storytelling and exorcising the ghosts of our ancestors. Love, Maren. The Sinner's Bench by Maren Bodenstein. This is a really marvelous book, I have to say. If you're interested in a good story, if you're interested in the history of South Africa, particularly KwaZulu-Natal, and the impact of the German Lutheran missionaries, then this is a book for you, really. I think it's an important book. So I'm not going to go on about the book too much. I've done an interview with Maren, and this is an intro, just to tell you what this is about. And I'm just going to tell you how I met Maren, and to me it's an interesting story. I bumped into Maren at a retreat about 20 years ago in the Hermannsburg, and she needed a lift back to Johannesburg, and I was glad to help, and we chatted on the way back, which was a delight because Maren is a good storyteller. Obviously, she's a writer. About 5 years after meeting her, I was on another retreat at Poplar Grove with Anthony Osler, just outside Colesberg. And the normal settling in thing when you arrive for a retreat, people turn up, you don't know who's going to be there. And Maren turned up, which was obviously, great. It's always nice to have Maren around. And she was really excited, and she told me that she had just discovered this most wonderful and fascinating story about her family. I get goose flesh still thinking about that actual day. And she was just like full of this story. And I'm not going to tell the story because the story is told in the book. But that was the first time that I came across that particular story. And then about 5 years ago, I approached Maren with a view to her mentoring me regarding my own writing, and I got to know her even better through that time. And at that point, her book, which was based on the story that she told us at the retreat at Poplar Grove, was nearing completion. So what I think really made it interesting to me is Maren grew up in a little village called Hermannsburg in KwaZulu-Natal, just outside Pietermaritzburg. And I grew up in Dundee, about 150 kilometers from that place. And we would drive down to Durban on occasion, and we would drive past a little German village outside Pietermaritzburg called Wartburg. And my father told me that there was this German community, and at one point there'd been a Nazi newspaper published there and so on. Seemed a bit odd because these were missionaries. I didn't think they would be involved in the Nazi movement. But unknown to me, Maren must have been a little girl living in that village because we were about the same age. So when this book came about, it gave me an insight into that community that for me was just completely fascinating. In Dundee, we had some of the people from that community living, the Klingenberg family, who owned a butchery. My mother would give me a little piece of paper with her order for meat on it, and I'd go off to the butchery and give it to these rather stern German men with their white coats, and none of them had all of their fingers. And I would stand there trying to look anywhere except at them while they sliced up the meat, because I didn't want to be witness to the loss of yet another finger. So to spend some time with this book gave me an insight into what was going on in that little German community. This is such a strange story. I did meet Maren's parents. They are now departed, but I met them at her wedding. And they reminded me a little bit of those German men in the butcher shop. They were quite stern. almost intimidating. It's like strange to me how two frail old people could be that stern and still slightly intimidating. Yeah. Anyway, Maren is a product of that. I'm not going to go on about the story. I'm going to encourage you to read it. I'm going to encourage you to watch the interview with Maren. She has a way with words. Enjoy.
My name is Maren Johanna Ermela Bodenstein. I come from the line of Bodenstein, stone of the ground, foundation stone, earth stone, soil stone. I read up about my name in a pink book, Names for Girls. Maren is a Nordic version of Mary, Maria, from Mare, the one who emerges from the sea. Aphrodite, the salty one, the bitter one. The bitter tears of Mary standing at the front of the cross. I asked my parents how they came to call me Maren. They told me that because our father believed in symmetry and the order of his children was boy, girl, another boy, and a girl, and so 5 years later when our mother was pregnant again, she of course would bear a boy. Why did you wait so long before you had another child? I pestered them. Was I a mistake? A tiny hesitation. Mama looked away, and Papa, irritated by her silence, replied quickly, No, of course not. We wanted you. You were wanted. And I, this boy, wanted, was going to be called Nicholas, like St. Nicholas, who is Father Christmas. But then I was a girl. They told me that Papa had read Theodor Storm's Die Regentrude to my mother while she was pregnant. It's about a girl, Maren, who goes into the underworld to bring back rain. So when I was born and did not turn out to be Father Christmas, my mother and my father decided to name me after a girl to wake up the rain queen. Much work awaited me. Yeah, I was born in Philippi in the Cape Flats. My father had got a short job. He was a teacher. Both my parents were teachers, and they had moved from a place called Hermannsburg in the Natal Midlands. And when I was 2, they moved back to Hermannsburg. It was a place my mother hated, and I never quite understood why she hated it. One of the thoughts that I had is because she was put into a boarding school there when she was about 11, and her father was in an internment camp. It was during the war. Anyhow, let me tell you a little bit about Hermannsburg. Hermannsburg was founded in 1856, and it was founded by a mission society which was started in Germany in a place called Hermannsburg in the heathlands, and it was started by a very charismatic preacher called Louis Harms, and it was after the Napoleonic Wars, and a lot of farms had grown too small, so the young men had to go to the cities and become artisans. And Louis Harms used to walk around and gather these young men. He used to go and hold sermons in communities, in the small villages, and then gather up these young men. And they then could decide to become missionaries because he wanted to found a mission society. And they had to learn for 7 years before they could go and become missionaries. He was a very, very successful gatherer of people and missionaries because he was charismatic. And he also collected a lot of money. He managed to get people to pay a lot of money. And he even got a guy from Hamburg to sponsor a a small little ship, not too small, and they had made connections in Ethiopia with some traders and who had guaranteed them that they would get to speak to the chiefs and start a mission station there. So the ship was called the Kandatsa, which is an Ethiopian queen in the Bible. I don't know where in the Bible, but anyhow. So they sailed all the way around Africa. They stopped in Durban to replenish their stocks and all their things. And there was a place already called New Germany in Durban. And they met a missionary, a Berlin missionary. They'd got there before the Hermannsburg missionaries and made connection. And then they went all the way up to Ethiopia. And when they got to Ethiopia, the inland people, the chief said, "What are you doing here? We don't want missionaries here." So they had to turn back all the way down the coast and to Durban. And in Durban, they connected with this pastor, this missionary, and the missionary said, "Why don't you set up a mission stations in Zululand? Because there are no mission stations there, and we've never gone into deep Zululand, into northern Natal and southern Natal." So they went and asked Chief Mpanda for land, and Chief Mpanda said, "Why should we want missionaries again?" So they decided to get a whole lot of money and buy a huge farm. And there they started a mission station. And, well, what happened is that 7 of them stayed. And what these missionaries always did, Louis Harms, was to couple the missionaries with some artisans so that they could start building and making things. So the first 7 missionaries were accompanied by blacksmiths, by woodworkers, by builders, etc. So they built this very big, beautiful mission house in the middle, and the climate and the vegetation is very much like Germany. And one of the first things they did was plant oak trees in this village. And then they built a chapel, etc. And from that mission house, they taught everybody Zulu there in the mission house. The missionaries went out into northern Natal and built up mission stations. So why it was useful to have a central place was so that the missionaries' children could have a school, and there was a German church. So the missionaries, when they got tired of being in Zululand, could go to a church where they could sing their German hymns. Anyhow, so this is where my grandfather landed as a young missionary, and he learned Zulu there. And then later he sent his children all to that school. And my mother was sent there during the war from East London because her father was away. So my parents grew up there, and then they went back as teachers to Hermannsburg. And they had us, except me, there. And I sort of grew up there. All my siblings and we grew up in this village. And the village consisted of a church at the top and a school at the bottom and one street. And the street was called Spinster Lane because there was a lot of missionary daughters that had looked after their fathers living in that lane. There weren't many married people. In fact, my brother was one of the first newborns in the village. It was a very old village full of missionaries. And that is where I grew up. To be a little girl in Hermannsburg actually gave us a lot of freedom because there were forests around, there were wild flowers on the meadow, and my parents weren't very sort of hovering parents. They used to go off to work, and we would just wander around in the village. And you could go and visit all the grannies in the village. And my brother was famous for walking, as soon as my parents had gone off to teach, he would walk down the street and stop at all the old ladies' houses, and they would say, "Are you hungry? Have you had breakfast?" And he said, "No, I never had breakfast." And then he would go to the next house and get breakfast. So he ate his way. And also through the old ladies' hearts, they adored him. And he got a couple of breakfasts out of the village. So it was, in one way, very free. We had to go to church a lot. And the missionaries often felt very stern, and everything felt quite musty around it. But there were teachers around that came from other places, and I must say, as a little child, you sort of grab all your freedoms, quite easily, whatever happens around you and whatever tensions there are. So it was quite a lovely place to grow up. My dad used to collect snakes because the teachers didn't earn much. So he caught snakes and sold them to the Durban snake park or whatever. And he used to keep them in the cellar. And a really well-known story in my family was that my brother, who was very much a leader, took all the kids while my parents were having a nap. He took them all downstairs into the cellar to look at the snakes. And they accidentally kicked the box, and all the snakes escaped. So I always think of our house as a house that had snakes in the cellar, and that actually fits in quite nicely because our family had secrets. We only spoke German and then Zulu, and until the age of 10, I couldn't speak English or Afrikaans. So it was an entirely German village and a very protected village. I mean, we had one shop which you could walk to, I think it was about 2 miles away. There was nothing commercial there. We grew our own vegetables. They slaughtered a pig or a sheep or a cow, like I think every 2 weeks, and then everybody ate of that. And you could sort of hear the shooting of a pig and the screeching of a pig every now and then. And my dad would go down. He liked the head of a pig because he could make sort of, I don't know what it's called, like a jelly with little bits of pig head in it, with curried jelly that you ate on your sandwiches when you come from Johannesburg, just before Pietermaritzburg, and then you drive past the Howick Falls, and you drive through a whole lot of little German villages, including Wartburg, New Germany, Harburg. And all along that road, lots of German farmers had settled, which was also part of the mission plan and part of colonizing with Germans. And then you got past at Greytown, and then you carried on, and there were lots of wattle trees. It was the Midlands. There was a tanning industry there, and the way we always shortcut this place is it's not too far from Nkandla. So our place was very insular. I mean, we lived in this one street with the church and the school, and that was the center of everything. There was a post office, which was very efficient. But we used to go, so Pietermaritzburg we went to for dentists and doctors. That was all. We never made trips there. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't necessary. Some of the interesting trips we did make was, but mainly when we had visitors from Germany, they wanted to see the real Africa. We would go down to Tugela Ferry and to Msinga, and then my father would tell them all about the Zulu culture. He spoke very fluent Zulu. And we would go and visit artists and craftspeople there, and everybody would stare at the young women with their bare breasts, and the other married women with their big headpieces made of cow dung, and the young men with their bare shoes, and so it would become quite an exotic trip. And the Germans would be beside themselves at seeing bare-breasted women walking around. And also the children were all there and they just wanted to photograph. And my dad used to take us to a specific carver, and then afterwards we would go visit a chief or an induna who would entertain the Germans and frighten me a little bit. He always threatened to feed me monkey meat. And that would be sort of, yeah, that would be some trips, and was always loved going there because the climate was very different. You went down an escarpment and we called it the Thorns because it was in, lots of acacias and dry and goats, etc. So that was one of the trips we did. My education was German, so until standard 6, everything was taught in German. We had teachers from Germany, but we also had teachers from Greytown so it was a very standard education. It was very good quality of education that I noticed afterwards. In fact, it was the oldest high school in Natal, and Louis Botha went there to high school. And in high school, we had fantastic German teachers, fresh out of Germany, and I got to read Nietzsche and Bertolt Brecht and all these very cool post-German, post-war writers and philosophers, etc. So, but otherwise it was pretty standard education, Natal education department education, but good quality. So, yeah. So the community grew in the 1960s, 1970s. There was a boom in South Africa, and the farmers grew richer. They had Mercedeses. Their families grew. The school grew, flourished. The whole village flourished. But my father was always a bit otherwise. So he got expelled from the school, which was a huge disaster because he thought of himself as somebody who would take over the school. And I think that obviously irritated people. So we moved to Johannesburg, but my siblings stayed on, and I then went to the German school in Johannesburg. But after, when I was in standard 6, my parents, there was always the obligatory confirmation into church. So you were sent back to the boarding school. They thought this was the best place. I think they also didn't feel like having their children in their house anymore. They were tired. I was the 5th. And they wanted to live their lives. So I was put back in boarding school, and I spent from standard 6 to matric in the boarding school and hated the insularity, hated being stuck there, hated being in a conservative place, but I had these wonderful German teachers, and some of them recognized that I would write well, and I wanted to leave school in standard 8 because I was just tired of it, and then my teacher got me by saying, "Oh, you're going to be a writer one day, so stay in school, it's important. Make use of this opportunity." And so I stuck it out in great misery. Yes, I did go on to become a writer, slowly, very slowly. I studied, I was a bit misguided because what do you do in matric when you want to become a writer? I'd gone to the Grahamstown Festival and I met Athol Fugard, and he spoke to the school children, and I asked, how do I become a writer? And he said, well, he had become a sailor and he had, worked his way through Europe, and he'd become an adventurer. And that's how you become a writer. But I mean, as a girl, to become a sailor, you can really, it wasn't the kind of thing. So I went to university and I nearly got caught up in becoming an academic. And luckily, I am not a natural academic or an intellectual. So I slowly made my way towards writing. I started writing children's stories because I wanted something with a beginning and a middle and an end, and I wanted to complete things. So, and then slowly work my way towards a novel, and I wrote short stories, and I got into programs, into the British Council had some fantastic programs. I got awards. I got sent to Sweden with other African writers, and then slowly worked my way into becoming a writer. But I was also always other things, because you can't make a living by being a writer, not in this country, unless you write bestsellers like Wilbur Smith, which was never my ability. To become a writer like that. And I also became a poet, because after writing novels, which all my writing takes me very long. This book that I've just written took me 5 years, and I think the previous book also took me 5 years. And then I thought, I'm tired of this. I'm going to write short little things like poems, and so that I can get them over and done with. So yes, that's how I became a writer. But when I left Hermannsburg, the very confined churchy school, we actually had to go to chapel twice a day, and then church every Sunday. And I started to hate church, because, all those pastors talking at you all the time. And then when I got out of school, I went to UJ, my dad, Pretoria University, RAU, Rand Afrikaans University, because my dad thought if I went to Wits, I would become a communist. The first week of joining Rand Afrikaans University, I met all the lefties in a poetry group. My dad didn't know about that. And very soon, I was in the whole initiation thing in RAU. And I refused, because I said it reminded me of the Nazis. So everybody said I was an Orthodox German and they would have to leave me alone. So they'd obviously nicely reinterpreted that I was far too religious to do all these things, because they couldn't say that I'd felt that all of this was very Nazi-ish. But anyhow, so then I moved to Hillbrow. And I lived it up. I used to walk around in the middle of the night in Hillbrow, and I would photograph people in the night. I would sit in coffee shops, in those lovely old coffee shops, Café de Paris, Café Zurich, and I would pick up men endlessly. I was suddenly thinking, this was it. I'm going to free myself by freeing my body and immerse myself in society in that way. So yeah, those were the wild years. This was I stayed in Hillbrow from 1980 to 1985, and then I moved to Yeovil, where there was another wonderful, alive place. And my life hasn't followed the conventional path. Yeah, I think I've always been an outsider. I was an outsider in Hermannsburg. I was an outsider at Rand Afrikaans University. And then even in Hillbrow, I was never in on the crowds. I was never in on the in circles. And I think that is part of being a writer, that you always observe things a little bit on the outside. Also, being a writer is often a sign of introversion and enjoying just stepping out and digesting things. I think I've always had to digest things more than other people. Or I've always needed to, it's like get overloaded by, because your radar is probably a little bit more sensitive than other other people's. So I think at the time my life was a bit wild and a bit self-destructive. But now in hindsight, I feel that was all part of who I am. I have very few regrets. No, I have no regrets. Yeah, I mean, I think I gave myself over a little too much to life and often didn't protect myself against people. But I think I've learned to protect myself, and then, you know, it also turned me towards a sort of a spiritual life, towards Buddhism, to just calm down. And I think I dated far too many assholes, and that is a regret, but hey, you learn. Well, the sinner's bench, oh, that is a very interesting thing about the Protestantism that I grew up in, is that a lot of it was based on sinning, and there was this whole sense that human beings are at the base sinful. Just that was, and the church would take you out of that sinfulness. And our church, the Lutheran Church in Hermannsburg, they sort of lagged behind the German church in Germany and sort of stayed much more in the 1940s, 1950s. So there was a much greater emphasis on sin. And one of the people I interviewed for the book said that she was there in the 1940s, and she once asked the pastor, because she also felt she wasn't a sinner. I never felt I was a sinner, so I couldn't understand what would make me sinful. And she asked the pastor, what is sin? And he said, by just asking that question proves that you are a sinner. So one of the secrets that came out of my family had to do with a bench in church where people that had committed sin, and it seemed like the main sin was adultery, had to sit on. And they had to sit on it for a while, and during that period, if they died, they wouldn't go to heaven, they couldn't get absolved. It was a very severe punishment. And I found the concept very interesting. So the book is basically about my family and the whole history of the missionaries and basically German colonization. And it takes place a lot in Hermannsburg because of that confined. The church had an iron grip on Hermannsburg. And I suppose my mother came from East London. She came from much more city kind of basis, and so she was much wilder. But she married my father also for stability, because she didn't have that stability, and she was quite wild herself. And so the book, my mother left me a huge kist of papers and lots of letters, and I went in search of what happened in our family by reading all the letters. And basically what I came across were these piles and piles of love letters between my parents that were so beautifully written. And I got to know my parents far too intimately, as often when you read their letters. And yeah, I'd like to read love letters, something about their love letters, if I may. So when my father finished, they sort of got engaged during my father's last year at university, and my mother just started university. They went to the University of Pretoria because actually at that time, because it was the war, they were not allowed to go to an English university. They'd wanted to go to the university in Pietermaritzburg, but they were not allowed. And my parents met again. They'd known each other at school, but they met again, and they were rehearsing a play called The German Beggarman. And my father was the beggar man and my mother was the beggar woman. And I found that quite poignant because they were both sort of almost abandoned children. So their whole relationship was based on that kind of need of a beggar. But anyhow, so while they were rehearsing, they suddenly, on the first rehearsal together alone, they realized, blink, there was a chemistry between them, and the first night they got engaged. Anyhow, so right at the beginning of their relationship, my father was about 23 and my mother was about 20. My father got a job in Cape Town, but it was the war and there was no money for a train even to Cape Town. So my father took a bicycle and rode from Escort, where he was living with his family, to Cape Town, and it took him about 10 days. So this is the intro to the story. To escape the heat, Hans often rides at night. Softened by the moonlight, he writes a long letter to Crystal. I miss you so, and tonight I long to go for a walk with you and your little sister. I want to show you the fragrant evening blossoms. Maybe the little flower fairies will peep out, ready for their night dance. Do you think there are still fairies in driest Africa? There used to be so many when I was young. Hans lives off dry bread which he dips in water. For dessert he eats a piece of chocolate. He is dirty, unshaven, his face is burnt, and his eyes are red from the hot wind. He looks like a tramp, he says. People everywhere are staring at him. Ah, he has become the beggar man, with a heart full of longing for his beggar wife. While Hans is pedaling across the country, Crystal sits on a farm in the middle of the country, pining for her man, waiting for the university to start. The first few weeks after her father's release have not been easy for everyone. Heine isn't really keen on farming life and is itching to take control. He suggests that they sell the farm, and there's a lot of fighting and arguing going on in the house. Crystal gets up early in the morning to sit on the veranda so she can write to her beloved. I feel as if somewhere in our house you are lying fast asleep, and that just now you will come around the corner and we will both run through the dew into the morning. Ah, how beautiful the world will be. While Crystal's love skips about in the daylight, Hans's dwells in the night amongst the moon and the stars, trying to locate himself in the big unfamiliar world he is traversing. I love riding north when the south wind helps me fly and everything rushes past me like in a dream. Even pedaling hard when the north wind holds me back is delicious. And now everything that I love is in the north. The blue Drakensberg, my parents, our special hill in Pretoria, all the people we have grown to love. And yes, soon you too will be in the north. You and our poor wounded motherland. And tonight the Southern Cross shines as cold and strange. It makes me sad. Crystal replies cheerfully, My dear Mr. Schoolmaster, Today I got up while the others were still fast asleep and walked down to the post office. But the train that carries the post was delayed, so I had to walk the 3 miles back. I made breakfast, and at 9 I marched back again. This time the train had arrived, but Mr. Fourie looked quite pale and strained. Soon I found out that it was because a very, very fat letter from Cape Town had delayed the train. Thank you, my Hanuman. The 3 miles back home weren't long at all. The goats along the railway line were wondering why every now and then I was laughing and saying out loud, "You rascal, you." And then came some cheeky lizard that looked out at me through the cracks in the tracks and said, "She is lucky. Do you remember how it was when we were still young and in love?" But I didn't listen to them too long because I was missing you so much. Oh, do come and visit on the farm, please, my Hanuman. But know that I won't let you go again. I'm going to tie you to a cabbage, or even better, to a sunflower. The book starts off with them in an old age home, them disintegrating and their world becoming small. My father had Alzheimer's, my mother was at Parkinson's. And it's a long description of how they fall apart and also how they were cared for by the carers and the neediness of my mother. And my father would sort of constantly brace himself against the wall, and there would be blood everywhere, and the smell of urine, and how we visited them once a week. I was living on a Buddhist retreat center and had to drive in from Mooinooi, make the trip down to the old age home, and how they would also still retain their dignity. And then just before my mother died, she revealed a secret about her life, which had to do with the sinner's bench. And this released her into dying. And 9 months later, my dad died, and I took a piece of, like a tablespoon or two of his ashes, and I went up into the Drakensberg, a place that he really loved, and I scattered the ashes on the plateau. My sister took some ash of my mother and scattered her in Morgan's Bay into the sea that she loved. And then the rest of the ashes, very sadly, they belonged to a church in Bryanston, a Lutheran church, was put into a cement vault at the church in a very barren place, and we put them together next to each other, and that's where they lie now. So when my parents died, I took the kist and I sorted out their letters, and I got to see why they behaved in the way they behaved. I got to see their lives. I got to see what was inside them and their history from young people during the war and what drove them. And I think very much that helped me to absorb quite a dysfunctional life. They didn't provide a very steady, they never grew up much out of that. And I think just going through this just softened me a lot. It made me escape the family story, which was often quite bitter towards my parents. And I feel so much softness towards them and so much understanding. And it was so lovely because they had a very fractious relationship. My mom kept running away and making demands, and my father was supposed to be womanizing, and I just got a great sense of their humanness and their vulnerability, and it really helped me. It's helped me become more peaceful about my childhood. It made me understand why my father needed the church and why my mother hated the church, and this sort of conflict in their marriage, which they always involved us in. So I think it softened me towards them. And I hope it softens the book will soften my siblings as well, that they can understand what happened. I suppose I don't, because I think because writing helps one digest so much. And through that, I don't have regrets much. I don't know, maybe if I think about it, I might find some regrets. I would have liked to have come into my own earlier. I was very much the one who had to wake up, go into the underworld for my family, and play a role in healing the family. And even the book plays a role in healing the family. And that role is quite difficult because you have to subsume who you are. So I would have liked to have found my voice and my power earlier. And I still find it quite difficult to sustain a sort of clarity in my creativity, or as a creative. I often don't believe enough in being a creative. But having played this role, I think, has given me the role of somebody who can listen well. It's also tuned me into people's lives because I was always watching what was going on in the family to smooth things over and to try and heal. So I don't feel the need to heal everybody anymore. I like the role that I do play as somebody who listens, and my tool of healing is not giving advice. My tool of healing is helping people to find their own voices through writing. I think I am more resolved and at peace with myself. Aging helps a lot because you don't have to prove so much. I think also having lived on a Buddhist retreat center and having been married and gone through that sudden, more conventional kind of life helped. I done that, and then when I emerged out of that again, I left. I just gained my strength and a much greater peace, and I've also been very ill, and this confronted me with death, which is a wonderful thing. It's really something that makes you see the bones of life, and that you don't take shit from life so much anymore. So, yeah, I think I am more at peace. I do think our world and our society is very much in denial about dying. And I think through Buddhism, that brings you into the present. You cannot be in denial. And through having gone almost through a process of dying, through illness, and I've always been interested in what it's like to die. being very intimately involved in my parents dying. In fact, in other people's dying, I feel quite natural with dying. I think it's partly a rural thing where you go to funerals on Saturdays and you watch the coffin sink into the ground and the soil knocking on it. Yeah, I think also the body slows down and you see just a kind of little decay. And I read a lot about dying. I belong to a group, a Zen group that of people that are terminally ill who talk about dying. And I see how much people resist dying. And for some reason, I feel quite peaceful, and it feels like quite a beautiful part of living. Yeah, I think with parents dying, you get very much confronted with dying. My siblings are quite upset that I'm closer to dying than them because they're all a lot older than me, and they find that very disturbing. My oldest brother's 10 years older than me. And I think it's brought them closer to death. But I think, again, with the writer's eye, you sort of get a bigger vision. And the whole book is a sort of a thing about times arising, lives ebbing, wars starting, wars going. It's about the cycles that we go through. So right at the beginning, I speak about my parents dying. Right in the middle of the book, they die. And it's watching generations come and go, like all the way from my great-grandparents to my grandparents to my parents to me to the next generation. I go back to Hermannsburg to see what's happened. And this little village that was so German conservative because the population died, not many people want to be German. There's a lot. Obviously, the school opened up to black children. And one of the ex-scholars, I forgot his name now, but he became very wealthy, and he is a black scholar. He bought the school when it was in crisis, and he bought it for a couple of million. And the first thing he did is restored the old chapel, restored the old buildings. And he's just been awarded something by the German government. And so that is such an interesting cycle of things. And I went back there to see what had happened and to see that cycle. And I think it's quite a beautiful cycle that happened to that village. It really ages you if you see, what you've lived through, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, 90s, 2000s. It's just, again, like, I think as you get older, you see things change in your own life from the most repressive apartheid years through to, I worked in Soweto in the 80s, which was a terrible time. And I saw the soldiers shooting at old women in Soweto. I saw all of this. I was terrified of the security police. My students were getting arrested. And then 1994, just all those rhythms of our lives, and that's what makes a long life, calm you down because you just see things come and go. And I've got the story is imbued with a sense of everything arising and passing. Wars are started and peace is made. People migrate and find a new home. Kittens are born and drowned. new generations take center stage and make space for the next one.